Good day, everyone. My name is Miss Ivy Pilar A. Ansis, and today I will be discussing with you one of the philosophical perspective in education, and that is realism. So, before we will proceed to the topic, let me first give you the different learning objectives that we wish to achieve in this report. First, we will define realism. Then, we will get to know the famous realist. Third, we will identify the philosophical position of realism, and then discuss the fundamental principles of realism, and then explain the different forms of realism, and finally, we will determine the implications of realism in education. So this will be the flow of my report. First, we will talk about the nature of realism. Here, we are going to define what realism is. Next, the philosophy of realism. To be specific, we will discuss the famous philosophers, then the philosophical position of realism, and then the 5 fundamental principles of realism. Third, we will discuss the forms of realism. We have 4 forms of realism. These are the scholastic, the humanistic, the social, and the sense realism. And finally, we have the implications of realism in education. So what are the implications of realism in education in terms of its aims? What about the curriculum? And what kind of teacher do we have in a realism education? What methods of teaching do realist educators use? And how does a classroom look like in a realism education? So, what is realism? According to C.V. Good, realism is the doctrine that objective reality or the material universe exists independently of conscious mind. Its nature and properties are being affected by being known. Swami Ramtirth also defined realism as a belief or theory which looks upon the world as it seems to us to be a mere phenomenon. So looking at these two definitions, it tells us that realism is about matter or the physical world being real. So it rejects the notion that only ideas are real. So if something exists, it is real regardless whether the human mind can perceive it or not. So, realism has 5 fundamental principles. One, it believes that the phenomenal world is true. When we say phenomenal world, it is the world that is perceivable, or the world that we construct out of the human conscious mind. Next, senses are the doors of knowledge, and it is the opposite of idealism, and it believes that man is a part of the material world, and it gives emphasis on experiment and observation. We cannot talk about realism without knowing these two philosophers or realists. First, we have Aristotle. Aristotle is the first prominent realist philosopher and known as the father of realism. He is the father of realism because he is the very founder of realism. He is also known as the father of scientific method. Later on, as we progress with this discussion, you will later find out that realism is really founded with science and reason and logical thinking. He is also the student of Plato who broke from his mentor's idealist philosophy. The very reason why realism was born is because he opposes the idea of Plato about ideas being the only thing that is real in this world. Okay. Another philosopher is Saint Thomas Aquinas. Saint Thomas Aquinas is an Italian priest and the founder of Thomism. He is also a Roman Catholic who believed of the existence of God. That's why he reconciled the idea of Aristotle and his idea of Christianity, and that God is real as matter is real. So to him, the key to happiness is for man to have both reason and faith. So how does realism position itself in terms of its philosophical view? So one is that man will discover reality if he makes use of science and common sense, and this can be achieved through education and learning. Another, mind is functioning and is geared towards creativity, and that reality can be proven by observation, by experiences, by doing experiments, and by means of scientific reasoning. And lastly, values must be studied to be applied in the actual setting. So before, people believe that values are inherited, but in realism, values can actually be studied so that man or a person can actually use it in the real life situation. Let us now go to the different forms of realism. First, we have the scholastic realism. Scholastic realism came about when medieval thinkers wanted to bring together a relation between faith or the Christian theology and reason or the classical philosophy. So for scholastic realists, they believe that faith and reason actually coexist. And St. Thomas Aquinas wrote a book entitled the Summa Theologica. Here, he explained the doctrines and the mystery of the Church, and he proved the existence of God with the use of philosophy. So, what are the characteristics of scholastic realism? One is that they relied on authorities from the past. Two, they synthesized knowledge. Three, they use deductive approach to reasoning. And fourth, they use logistic logic. So, deductive approach to reasoning is the opposite of inductive. So, here, for deductive, they give reasons starting from broad to specific and from abstract to concrete. Okay? So, now, syllogistic logic or syllogism is a logical argument based on two premises. For example, if I say man is mortal, John is a man, therefore John is mortal. So that is one example of logical argument in syllogism. So to continue, scholastic schools use two methods of teaching. One is lectio and the other is disputatio. So for lectio, this is a simple reading of text done by the teacher. And here, questions are not being allowed to be asked by the students. Now, disputatio is the opposite because here, questions are already allowed and questions are asked or announced beforehand for the purpose of discussion, or these questions are meant to be disputed. That's why it's called disputatio. And for lecture, I think this is where they got the term lecture because there is only a simple reading of text by the teacher. So here, teachers have the liberty to choose what kind of method of teaching they think are best for the students. Another thing about scholastic realism is that it believes that education is the process by which man lifts himself up to the eternal. That's why scholastic realism is very heavy on the explanation about faith and about the existence of God. The next form of realism is the humanistic realism. So this came after the Renaissance period. So when we say Renaissance period, it is also called the rebirth or the revival of the art and literature. So this type of realism is more about man. That's why it's called humanistic or human. It's about man and how he looks for solutions to his problems. So this kind of realism is not really a fan of the classics or the literature. It's more of the content. So when it does make use of stories or literature, it is so it can help man look for solutions to his present problems. Two of the famous realists are John Milton and Francois Rabelais. That's how you pronounce the name. It's a French name. So I actually searched YouTube on how to correctly pronounce the name, and it says Francois Rabelais. So anyway, according to John Milton, education in the humanistic realism is about preparing man for the real life in the real world. And for Francois Rabelais, he believes that education is gained through books, though emphasis should be on the mastery of their content and their actual use in the real life. And he also believes that education should be attractive rather than compulsive. So if you notice, humanistic realism is really pro-human. So it's about man preparing himself to survive in the real world, or man helping him look for solutions for his problem and making education actually fun and attractive. The next is social realism. Now, social realism rejects the idea that education should only focus on producing scholars and professional men instead of producing men of practice. Now, social realists also follow the travel of journey method. This travel of journey method is like the associating strategy wherein, for example, you imagine a journey and you remember to place items along the way. It's like putting a landmark so that you remember the place. And one of the aims of social realism is to train a gentleman in preparation for a social life and to be a practical man of the world. That's why it's called social realism. So it's more on helping man to be ready in the social life. Social realism also deals with the study of oneself and also of others. So in social realism, it is important that a person will have a direct contact with other people and even with places and things, because this is one way for a person to learn. So education in social realism should be about equipping learners so that they will have a happy and a successful life as a man of the world. And lastly, we have sense realism. Now, this form of realism stresses more importance to the study of natural sciences and contemporary social life. When we say natural sciences, basically it's like flora and fauna. the nature and the environment that surrounds us. And contemporary social life is like the present modern life. Okay. It also emphasizes the training of the senses. So for sense realism, the use of our senses is important to gain knowledge. Okay, so learning takes place when we train and develop our senses. So basically, we learn when we make use of our senses, like when we observe, when we listen, when we look, when we touch. So senses are important for learning in this type of realism. The aim of sense realism is to develop a natural society by working in accord with the laws of nature. When you say natural society, it's like having a balance and order among people, and this is achieved through having set of rules and policies that people must follow. Also, sense realists believe that the purpose of man is really to have happiness with God. And through education, man can still know the laws of nature, and by knowing these laws of nature, they can thereby control nature. There are two characteristics of sense realism. One is the formulation of basic assumptions. This is where the use of the senses will come in, because by using our senses, we observe, and by observation, we can come up with our basic assumptions. Okay. Second is the formulation of new curriculum based on natural sciences and contemporary life. So education in sense realism really focuses on teaching natural sciences and the contemporary. Sense realists also emphasized on three things. One is the application of inductive method. This is a concept made by Francis Bacon. So since sense realism is really about doing observations, they make use of the inductive method. So inductive method is like starting from the specific observations going to the broader generalizations. And next emphasis is to replace instruction in Latin by the instruction in vernacular. So before, in this realist era, the most famous or most used language is Latin. Unlike now, today, we make use of English as our universal language. So since realists found out or realized that students learn best when they are being taught in the vernacular or their mother tongue. And the third one is to substitute new scientific and social studies in place of the studies in language and literature. So again, realism is really not a fan of the language and the arts or the literature. So they are really more on the science and the social studies side. Finally, let us discuss the different implications of realism in education. First, let us talk about the aims of realism in education. One is that it aims to understand objective reality through the diligent and unsparing scrutiny of all observable data. In other words, it makes use of scientific method to do inquiry and observation. Next is that it aims to prepare the child for happy and successful life and also for the real life. Next, it aims to develop and train the senses, and it aims to acquaint the child with nature and social environment. So if you have noticed, part of the curriculum of the realism education is really about practical skills, about natural sciences, and about social studies. And finally, it aims to help individuals understand and apply the principle of science to help man solve the problems in the world. Since realism is really more about helping man solve his day-to-day problems, its curriculum is crafted in such a way that it is problem-centered or subject-centered, and it's practical and useful. The curriculum is also scientifically approached, standardized, and distinct discipline-based because realism is very objective. It makes use of facts and reason, and it's very procedural. So its subjects also include the natural sciences, the physical science, history, culture, physical exercise, math, geography, history, and astronomy. So if you notice, these subjects are deemed to be necessary for man to thrive or to survive in the real world. So, what kind of a teacher does realism education have? So, in realism, the teacher must organize and present content systematically within a discipline, and she has to demonstrate the use of criteria in making decisions. So, when we say presenting content systematically, it's like making use of a procedure, or planning is very important for a teacher in a realism education. And the use of criteria is also necessary when a teacher has to like rate or evaluate his or her students. So it's similar to the rubric that we are using today. Okay, and a teacher must also be educated and well versed with the custom of belief and rights and duties of people and the current trends. So in realism education, a teacher must be an expert or a master of her own field and has to be well aware of the beliefs, the rights and the duties of the people and also of what is happening in the society. Because again, the role of the teacher is to help her students and guide her students to be ready in the practical world. So how will she do this if she herself is not aware of what is happening in the society? So she has to be aware of the different trends and the different customs of the people. Some more roles of the teacher is to be able to expose and guide the students towards the hard realities of life. So this is the reason why the teacher must be well versed of what is happening in the society, because it will be her duty to help her students overcome life problems or the different difficulties in the real world. So another is that the teacher should define simple rules. So this defining of simple rules is making students aware of the things that they should not do and they should do. And the teacher must also know the interest of the child and to teach accordingly. So why is it important for the teacher to know the interest of her learner? It's because one of the aims of education of realism education is to make education attractive and fun for the students. So if the teacher knows the interest of the children, then it will be easier for her to teach her students. Realist teachers make use of teaching methods that focus on mastery of facts and basic skills through demonstration, recitation, drills, exercises, and experimentation. They also put emphasis on critical reasoning through observation, and since realism is more on helping students be prepared in the real life, its approach is more hands-on, so it's performance-based. And teaching methods also include scientific research and development, and also they use inductive method, which is teaching from simple to complex and from concrete to abstract. And to enhance student learning, teaching methods in the realism education also make use of direct or indirect experiences. So they send students to field trips, they make their students attend lectures, they watch films, or make use of TV and audiovisual aids. Also, they make use of computer technology and the library. All of these for the purpose of enhancing student learning. So teaching methods also include the use of facts, analysis, and questioning. And if you remember, in one of the forms of realism, vernacular is also used as a medium of instruction, because accordingly, the use of the mother tongue will help students learn more. Okay, precision and order are also being used as teaching methods. So when we say precision and order, it involves the ringing of the bells. So ring of the bells to signify either the start of the class or the end of the class. They also use time periods or the scheduling of classes. Daily lesson plans and pre-packaged curriculum materials are also being used by the teachers. So if you notice, teaching methods in the realism education is very well organized. It's systematic and it's really about planning. And finally, how does a classroom in a realism education look like? So, classroom in a realism education focuses on the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. So, if you remember in scholastic realism, one of the methods being used there is lectio, wherein the teacher is using simple reading of text. So, because one of the skills that realist teachers want to teach their students is reading. Okay, and then classroom environment is highly structured and organized. Education should be fun and interesting for the student, and education should prepare students for the life in the real world. So that's the last of my topics, but before I will end, let me first give you some of the important points that were discussed in this report. So one, in realism, scientific investigation and senses are used in order to learn. Second, realism focuses on the physical world and that this physical world is composed of matter. Realists believe that schools should promote human rationality through observation and experimentation. Realist teachers believe in the importance of experimental learning, and in order to enhance learning, students have to take a hands-on approach. We also learned that realism is problem-centered or subject-centered, and that it concentrates on the humanistic and scientific principles. In realism also, teachers focus on teaching scientific methods of problem-solving, and that teachers should be experts in their subject matter. We also learned that character is developed through training in the rules of conduct, and finally, realism prepares students in the real world. So I am not taking all the credit in the making of this output. So I'm sharing here with you the references that I used as a basis in the making of this report. So I have flashed them here. Once again, I am Miss Ivy Pilar A. Ansis. I hope that you learned something from this report. Thank you for your time and God bless everyone.